Thank you, Stephanie, and a warm welcome to everyone. I know you're joining us from around the world. Looking at your names, I know many of you in the attendee list. I'd love to welcome Professor Tami Navarro to the first of our three-part series conversations on anti-racist feminist organizing. We are really privileged to have her today. Tami is the Associate Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women and the editor of the journal Scholar and Feminist Online. She's a cultural anthropologist whose work is published in Cultural Anthropology, American Anthropologist, Transforming Anthropology, Small Axe Salon, The Caribbean Writer, Social Text, and Feminist Anthropology. She serves on the board of the St. Croix Foundation and is the member of the editorial board for the journal Small Axe, the Caribbean Journal of Criticism. She's the co-host of the podcast, Writing Home, American Voices from the Caribbean, and her book, Virgin Capital, Race, Gender, and Financialization in the U.S. Virgin Islands, will be published by SUNY Press and will come out later this year. So very warm welcome to Professor Tami Navarro, and we look forward to hearing your conversation today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone at the Center for this invitation. I'm really looking forward to being included and kicking off the series, and I look forward to talking with all of you during the question and answer session. So for the purposes of this talk, I have divided my comments into two sections. The first addresses my work in the Black feminist tradition, outlining strategies and modes of operation that I and others have found effective. And the second half of my remarks will focus more strictly on my ethnographic work, laying out the ways that explicitly centering race and gender in my anthropological work has produced particular insights. So with that in mind, I'll begin. 1, the marvelous arithmetics of distance, or going far together. As I sat down to put together these comments about feminist and anti-racist strategies, I thought about what I know. As a scholar and activist who has been both theorizing and engaging in Black feminist praxis for the better part of 20 years, I have found that one of the key elements of successful organizing is an emphasis on collectivity and the displacement of a singular individual as the defining marker of a movement's success. Black feminist movements such as Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, and the Combahee River Collective serve as the ground upon which contemporary feminist coalitions, such as, for example, the Crunk Feminist Collective, have emerged. Much of the work that I do, including co-authoring work for peer-reviewed publications and co-creating a podcast that centers the voices of Caribbean diasporic authors, is done in community with people I think and work alongside with. The with here is key, particularly for someone working within anthropology, a discipline that has a history of speaking for. This decision to work collaboratively is important. This is not to say that this approach is without its costs. For those whose careers depend upon the approval of the academy, this decentering of the individual can be difficult to enact, as troubling the notion of a sole producer of knowledge or agent of change is in tension with the demands of the academy. The expectation in many disciplines of a single authored monograph as the determinant of one's financial well-being in the form of tenure can lead scholar activists to render their social justice work to the margins. And yet, it is in dwelling in community that creates space for so much activist and vitally intellectual work to take shape. So recently I have been reading Alexis Pauline Gumb's new work, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. In this text, Gumbs outlines what she terms her marine mammal apprenticeship, looking beyond the human to draw lessons about adaptation and subversive action from dolphins and other marine mammals. In one section, she writes, quote, "What does it mean to function as a group in a changing environment? How can we organize ourselves intentionally to combat the embedded isolation of late capitalism? From massive dolphin superpods to pan-tropical synchronized swimming as a model of being prepared for large-scale direct action, The dolphins are educating us on how to squad or pod up, end quote. This focus on collective action as a strategy that enables feminist and anti-racist work is, again, not without its complications, as it brings with it questions of hierarchy and leadership, issues that many Black feminist collectives have long been mindful of. Here I'm thinking of movements such as Black Lives Matter, an organization without a formal hierarchy and which is purposefully structured as a decentralized network of activists. However, I'm also thinking of my own communal social justice work, which at this moment is largely done through the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, or VISCO, a group that 3 colleagues and I co-founded to address what we saw as the dearth of meaningful engagement with the liminal positioning of the US Virgin Islands, an American possession that, like its neighbor Puerto Rico, exists today as an unincorporated territory of the United States. This collective consists of myself, an anthropologist, a philosopher, a novelist, a visual artist, a composition that has a bit of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker about it. And yet this makeup is deeply intentional. This crossing of not just disciplines, but ways of knowing is purposeful. The various forms of training and framings we bring to this collective are perhaps its greatest strength, enabling us to both ask and attend to questions about Black life in the United States Virgin Islands, past and present. So to give a fuller sense of this collective and our intentions, I'll just read briefly an excerpt from our mission statement, which reads in part: St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, the group of islands currently known as the United States Virgin Islands, but formerly the Danish West Indies, are crucial spaces for thinking through questions of sovereignty, personhood, and belonging. We are a group of academics, artists, and activists who are committed to centering the Virgin Islands as a site of inquiry and theorization beyond a notion of utopia or a space that is not meaningfully occupied. As founders of this collective, we situate this group as a multidisciplinary framework through which we and others are able to study and understand the Virgin Islands. Our conceptualization allows for various connectivities with Puerto Rico and the British Virgin Islands. We, the VI Studies Collective, are centrally concerned about the erasure of this territory from larger discourses and the lack of resources to attend to our community's needs, most notably the silences surrounding the territory's continuous colonial subjection, the lack of cultural institutions to preserve Virgin Islands history, and the ecological precarity demonstrated by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. As a group of Afro-Caribbean women, we 4 are committed to a practice of collaborative production and inclusion. We explicitly engage in collective knowledge production and seek out partnerships at all levels that are beneficial to all parties, including citational practices and resource sharing, end quote. So taking our cue from those who have engaged in collective action before us, our structure within this collective is rhizomatic, prioritizing knowledge production and collaboration. Yet, I say yet, again, because I do not want to suggest that it is possible to implement this approach without difficulty. As but one example, on jointly authored essays, the question of lead authorship, professionally necessary for some, less so for others, must be addressed. Positioning must be attended to. A collective approach to knowledge production organizing necessitates delving into the messy complexity of various positionings, forms of access, and legibility. Which is to say, it requires acknowledging structural and individual issues of access and equity. Despite what might be characterized as this additional layer of labor, attending to multiple, sometimes conflicting needs, this collaborative approach has produced, for me, a more capacious approach to both knowledge production and spaces of intervention. So while I have thus far been talking in particular about what can be learned from Black feminist thinking and action, these lessons have important applications far beyond reparative justice for the Black community. As the Combahee River Collective wrote in their landmark statement, quote, If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression, end quote. This naming of white supremacy and anti-Blackness as a framework which works against racial justice helps to make sense of widely varying but deeply entwined forms of violence, including the indiscriminate killing of unarmed Black people, the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol, and the violent and dangerous moment of anti-Asian violence we are currently inhabiting. Centering white supremacy as the impulse behind these seemingly disparate actions presents us with the possibility that one strategy we might consider is going together, working in coalition across space, time, discipline, and borders. 2, theorizing women's work, race, gender, and neoliberal development. My most recent anthropological project was an analysis of a tax holiday program operating in the US Virgin Islands, an American territory consisting of 3 main islands, St. Thomas, St. John, and the largest and poorest of these islands, St. Croix. This program, the Economic Development Commission, or EDC program, centered around convincing financial management companies on the US mainland to relocate their operations to the USVI in exchange for generous tax policies, including up to a 90% reduction on income tax. In exchange, these companies were contractually obligated to stimulate the local economy by hiring workers. It is this requirement of hiring which largely produced employment opportunities for young women in the territory that became one of the central areas of analysis in my work. The employees working in this sector became known colloquially as EDC girls, a subject position tied to longer histories of feminized labor in the region. These women, largely drawn from the middle and upper class on St. Croix, often found employment in the well-paying EDC sector, a development which served to widen pre-existing gaps of wealth and opportunity in this US territory in ways that often frustrated the broader community. So my approach to this project focused on the material conditions as well as the local and global histories that facilitated the emergence of a financial services sector in the USVI. This orientation created space for me to engage with both the on-the-ground realities and the variously positioned actors that made these circulations possible. This approach is grounded in the understanding that actual people in actual places make the financial circulations of programs like the EDC possible. Among others, Karen Ho and Laura Baer have done important work on this in other contexts, understanding the role of the individual and importantly, the positioned actors in making these seemingly meta flows possible and thinking through how these grounded relationships actually facilitate these connections. So this decision to contextualize the lives of Virgin Islanders who found work in this sector and to situate their position within a longer trajectory in my work resulted in an analysis that necessarily centered race, color, class, and gender. The history of the space in which I was working was such that these long-standing hierarchies suffused the operation of the EDC program. It wasn't that I was looking for them, but rather that I would have had to purposefully ignore them to produce a different rendering of life on the ground. Some of the local hierarchies of privilege that predated this program included class, but also extended to mobility, age, gender, and color. This final consideration is key as it was not just simply race, but also color or shade that marked the middle class, often lighter skinned job candidates as desirable employees in these offshore offices, connecting this neoliberal labor opportunity to longer histories of color privilege in the Caribbean. Here, I'm thinking most immediately of the category of brown or browning in Jamaica, but examples can be found throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Race, color, and labor have long been deeply entwined in the Caribbean. Historian Barbara Bush, for instance, has detailed the history of color impacting forms of labor assigned to enslaved workers, such that those with lighter skin were viewed as more suited to work indoors, while those with darker skin were often at work outdoors in plantation fields. For my interlocutors in the US Virgin Islands, this comparison to plantation labor was particularly astute, as they positioned the EDC program as an attempted return to what they called, quote, slave days. This framing, seeing the emergence of a financial services sector in the USVI as a return to many of the patterns and hierarchies of plantation agriculture, was one that named the continuities residents saw between enslaved labor and the neoliberal model of financialization as development. While there is much more to say on this, and I address it more fully in my forthcoming book, what is relevant for our purposes today is that the operation of the EDC demonstrates the continuing import of gender ideology and processes of racialization in relation to labor opportunities in the Caribbean in this moment of neoliberalism. So I've already said a bit about some of my insights on the EDC program, but here I just want to take a step back and say a few words about the history of the program and orient everyone to how it came to be. In 2001, the local government of the USVI partnered with the federal government to institute the EDC program, an initiative that encouraged financial services companies to relocate to this territory. As a result, St. Croix in particular became home to a community of primarily American financial firms and their managers. So while funds in the Caribbean have long been viewed as suspicious, as simply attempts to evade US tax requirements, here we can think about the Cayman Islands or even the nearby British Virgin Islands, which has come under fire for being sort of circuitous spaces of evading US tax regulation. The EDC program represented an attempt by the local government at legitimate banking and financial management in the Caribbean. Because of St. Croix's long struggling economy, a situation made worse by its long omission from many cruise ship itineraries, and worse still by the closing of the island's largest private employer, an oil refinery with a questionable history of environmental impact, employment within the EDC sector had been particularly desirable. Despite their promise of employment, however, these companies were also seen by local residents as unstable and suspicious, a reputation earned as a result of a number of federal investigations at various EDCs on charges of operating shell companies, the most well-known of these being the 2009 arrest of EDC businessman Alan Stanford on charges of conducting a multi-billion, with a B, dollar fraud, a crime for which he is currently serving a 110-year prison sentence in the US mainland. Beyond such egregious individual transgressions, however, many on St. Croix have long been frustrated as what they saw as a different issue, the fundamental imbalance of benefit for the territory in relation to the EDC program, arguing that while these companies save millions of dollars, the Virgin Islands, and vitally Virgin Islanders themselves, receive relatively little from these companies. One editorial in a St. Croix newspaper outlined this position, arguing, quote, "We are taxing the poor and allowing the rich to come here and live without making just contributions. We are giving away the cow and the milk," end quote. This perception of the disadvantageous position of Virgin Islanders in relation to the EDC program has only been deepened by the charge that these companies find ways to creatively circumvent local hiring requirements to which they're subject, including claiming a lack of qualified local applicants and relocating existing stateside workers to fill vacant openings. All of this is crucial to the operation of the program, but here I want to discuss in more detail the complex positioning of the Virgin Islanders, many of whom are young women who find work in this sector. The contractual obligation that EDC companies hire local workers has resulted in both the deepening of pre-existing divisions, these hierarchies I mentioned, and the creation of a new subject, the EDC girl, a middle-class, often mainland-educated Virgin Islands woman. I'm particularly interested in the position of these workers, local women employed in this sector, and the situated histories and contemporary expectations that shape their experiences. In what remains of these remarks, I want to take up some of the expectations that inform and shape the lives of these workers, as well as the ways they navigate these expectations. For example, these women owe their employment, at least in part, to their presumed difference from other Virgin Islanders. That is, their pre-existing position of relative privilege, including access to private education and often the lack of a detectable accent. However, it is through their sameness as fellow Virgin Islanders that members of the local community make their claims on these women, often asking them to spend their EDC salaries in particular community-driven ways. This is a precarious positioning for female EDC employees. They are afforded remarkable opportunities and possibilities as a result of their affiliation with this program, but they are also part of, and in the view of some, financially responsible to the wider community on St. Croix. The hiring practices within the EDC sector, inflected by gender, class, age, and even color, have been the subject of much frustration in the local community. Deepening this frustration is the widespread assumption that these jobs are well-paying and do not require much labor on the part of local workers, making their salaries seemingly easy money. This assessment that local employees are hired in support positions and then not expected to perform much labor was echoed by the CEO of one EDC company I spoke with, who stressed that their office had been having a difficult time hiring as, quote, the candidates all came in with a wink and a nod, end quote, expecting to be paid very well for little labor. This money then, these EDC salaries, they're seen as, if not ill, then certainly questionably gotten. This view, combined with hiring preferences that build on historic privilege, results in the sentiment on St. Croix that this money is easily earned and that EDC girls who are the recipients of this capital should spend it easily and conspicuously. So here, I'd just like to give a quick ethnographic example. While window shopping in Christiansted, a main shopping district on St. Croix, one Saturday with a friend who had recently begun working at an EDC company, the salesman at one clothing store, also a longtime friend who had heard the news of her recent hire, encouraged us to come in, teasing her that she ought to, quote, spend up that EDC money. In this exchange, the questionable source of this money, gotten quickly and presumably for little labor, was clear, marking it as EDC money somehow set apart. While we didn't buy anything that day, in fact, we didn't even go into his store, her frustration at being publicly marked in this way was clear. This exchange is but one instance that demonstrates local perceptions of these workers as seemingly lucky recipients of EDC money who are encouraged to dispose of their salaries by consuming in community-driven ways. The classification of EDC jobs as high-paying is largely responsible for spending expectations surrounding these salaries. A PricewaterhouseCoopers report found that salaries paid to EDC employees averaged $66,000, more than double the US VI average of $31,000 for the same period. Despite this disparity, the speculation of fantastic sums presumably paid to local EDC employees did not, I found, always correspond to the reality of entry-level positions. At the same time, this assumption of newfound wealth marked these employees with the social stigma of the program, remember that indictment of Alan Stanford, and burdened them with familial and societal responsibilities they often resented as unfair. These financial expectations made their way into my interviews, as many of the EDC workers I spoke with complained that they frequently received requests for loans or even gifts of money, and were often encouraged by local vendors to spend up that EDC money. I'm particularly interested in this demand as it is rooted, I argue, in two assumptions. The first is that EDC salaries are easily gotten. That is, that these positions inherently require little to nothing in the way of labor. The second assumption is that EDC girls are in the position to right the perceived wrongs of the program. This expectation demonstrates the tension between the neoliberal focus on the individual and more community-driven forms of spending. That is, as many on St. Croix object to what they understand as the imbalance of benefit in relation to this program, the spending of EDC workers is expected to mediate this imbalance. That is, to put EDC money in the hands of Virgin Islanders who would not otherwise have access to this exclusionary sector. Virgin Islanders who, like many people of color, have continued to find themselves at the bottom of the global economic pile in the wake of development policies and programs, have expectations regarding the curative potential of the spending of EDC girls. This remains problematic, relying on a number of gendered assumptions as the disappointments felt by Virgin Islanders from the financial services as development model are supposed to now be addressed through the position of these young women. That is, as they recognize the ways they are structurally disempowered in global financial circuits, Virgin Islanders seek to exert increased authority and societal pressure on these local women. This bind in which EDC girls find themselves reveals something interesting about expectation, as community members feel at ease mapping their structural concerns and interests out through the behavior and spending patterns of these workers. That these concerns about the contemporary development processes are played out through the bodies and paychecks of Virgin Islands women is in line with concerns long expressed by feminist scholars like Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty, who will be presenting a lecture in this series, who have pointed to the multiple ways women and their bodies are used to stand in for national concerns. At any rate, the lived reality for most of the EDC girls I spoke with was that they had pre-existing financial responsibilities, including school fees, transportation costs, and family expenses. In the lives of these workers then, the money they earned was not simply disposable income, despite the expectations of community members. Rather, their salaries simultaneously placed them in a unique category of affluence and made them subject to additional financial expectations on the island. The assumption that EDC girls should spend their relative wealth around the island, that is, that they will provide, is one that was broadly shared by their family, friends, and often mere acquaintances. So given the impact of the EDC program and the historical inequalities, these hierarchies it amplifies, it would be tempting to understand the initiative as one that has allowed white people from the mainland US to relocate to this territory and consume the island and its resources. However, this reading discounts the agency of the Virgin Islanders who shared their life experiences with me during our conversations and interviews. The insights and strategies they shared with me point to the fact that the opportunities afforded to women at work in EDC companies result in change for both the island and impacts the program. I understand these women as drawing on both their background and their current status as EDC employees to make their lives possible. As the wealth of EDC people is not seen as being reliably beneficial to the broader community on St. Croix, the spending of EDC girls is expected to meet this obligation. As the money earned by EDC girls is presumed to be easily gotten, their fellow Virgin Islanders expect these women to dispose of their newfound relative wealth conspicuously, spreading it throughout the community. These insights about the relationship between gender ideology, processes of racialization, and economic well-being have come about as a result of taking seriously their impact on the lives and lifeways of my informants, an approach that extends across my work. While the two halves of these comments have addressed different aspects of my work, there is, to my mind, a clear through line. As with my work in the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, the conclusions I draw from my ethnographic work came about as a result of taking seriously the positioning of EDC girls, as well as their needs, wants, and broader visions for their lives. Thank you.
Tami, thank you so much for that incredibly powerful, informative, and provocative conversation that you've engaged us in. I want to spend a few minutes digging deeper, thinking through some of the themes, approaches, and methods that you use to carry out your research, but also to inform the scholarship and activism that you engage in. And then we'll move on to take questions from our audience members. I know they will have many, so I certainly don't want to monopolize the time. You mentioned sort of this link between consumerism and community on the island, particularly in relation to the EDC girls. How did some of these agentic behaviors come about in terms of any resistance or sort of disrupting the consumerism and community connection, where the girls might have felt that they had some different alternatives in how they decided on spending the money or capital that they were accumulating?
Thank you. I appreciate that question, Banu, because these comments were taken from a much larger section of my work. And so I appreciate the opportunity to expound on some of this. Yeah, so some of the agentic practices that the women that I worked alongside would engage in is they would purposely remove particular markers of their sector related identities. So this company that I talked about, Stanford Financial, where the CEO is now imprisoned, was perhaps the sort of the poster child for this program during the period of my fieldwork. And there was a very particular dress that everyone had to wear, sort of style of uniform, particularly the women, which included a lapel pin. It was a sort of golden lapel pin in the shape of an eagle, which seems like a really small sort of anecdotal note, but it wasn't. It was actually a sort of key marker of their identity and their affiliation with this program, and relatedly their presumed wealth, right? That they had money to spend and money, that these were the people you wanted to be targeting. So that these women would talk about the ways in which they would purposely remove this marker or change their shoes or their pants before doing something like going to a particular supermarket, so that they could sort of avoid these really draining conversations and demands on their time. And I mean, people would just walk up to them and hand them resumes or say, can you get me a job? I'm in a really bad financial situation. So they were aware of these demands, and they sort of found quotidian ways to try to sort of navigate them. But more squarely to your point about spending, there was a lot of pressure to spend in these particular ways, right? To have a luxury kind of vehicle, to live in a certain neighborhood, to travel to the mainland and internationally, which sometimes these women capitulated to because it coincided with their desires and financial abilities. And other times they didn't, right? So I mentioned in that vignette that I shared in this talk, we didn't even go into that store, right? But there was a sort of playfulness that emerged because they were in community as longtime friends and sort of community members, that she could sort of play it off, right? That she could say, well, I'm not going to come in today. One, because she couldn't afford it and wasn't interested, but it's through that kind of deep community connection that she was able to sort of jokingly step aside and not sort of feel pressured into buying, you know, a $200 dress that she didn't want anyway. So this is what I'm saying, that it's sort of the oldness, the sort of long-standing community networks of being someone's cousin, somebody went to grade school with you. It's a very small place. St. Croix is only 84 square miles. So it's a sort of long-standing relationships, along with the newness that has come along with being identified as related to this sector, right? So I see them drawing on both of those sort of parts of their identity that are sometimes in conflict, but sort of also open up spaces of agency for them to sort of maneuver.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, right? They're sort of transforming their selves both physically and in, I suppose, how they inhabit the spaces. You talk very, importantly about how in Black feminist traditions, it's very important to produce knowledge with sort of the epistemological, leaning in an ethical one as well, is to produce knowledge with the community. How did you think about these issues as you engaged upon ethnographic work in the US Virgin Islands? I know that in our attendees, we certainly have folks who are qualitative ethnographers and just really thinking through the ethical considerations of producing knowledge with. Can you take us through that?
Absolutely. And thank you for that question. I had hoped that the sort of tail end of my comments allowed me to stitch together what in my mind is a sort of cohesive package of the way I approach my work. But this gives me the opportunity to talk it out a bit more. So for me, my problem was slightly different, or my ethnographic wrinkle was slightly different, in that I am from the US Virgin Islands. So this was my home site, my field site. And so I was presented and I'm not unique in this, with the question of how was I going to distance myself in particular ways from people that I had known, in some cases, my entire life, right? So we had these sort of layers of connection, and I had to privilege my anthropological self, which is something that anthropologists have done from Zora Neale Hurston onward. But it became important for me professionally and politically that I approach this as a creation of knowledge with the community. So this is how I sort of came to this lens of thinking through the tension between the neoliberal emphasis on the individual, right? These girls as a sort of repositories of wealth or whatever access they could gain, and the community trying to sort of demand, right, a more equitable distribution in ways that are incredibly problematic and rely on gendered and generational tropes, clearly. But just seeing the sort of deep need in the community and the ways that people were sort of trying to access what seemed to be the sort of saving grace for a really struggling economic space. I mean, St. Croix is doing really badly. So the reason that I always talk about the territory as a whole is that most people have probably heard of St. Thomas because of its sort of pride of place in the sort of global tourist market. St. John less so, but also doing really well in the sort of niche luxury tourism market. St. Croix has really sort of been left out in a lot of those conversations and circulations. Historically, having its economy be rooted in agricultural production through the moment of enslaved labor, even up until, sort of now there's a resurgent moment of small scale farming because it's much larger than these other two islands, right? Which has been less economically productive than the sort of tourism that the other two islands have turned to. So it's historically short on funds. And so this program has had a really outsized impact on St. Croix in particular, which is the island that I'm from. So it became important for me to tell this story, yes, of a neoliberal development model, but also to tell the story of these Virgin Islanders that I was in community with as a person, but also as an anthropologist, and that I saw the sort of deep disappointment that echoed historically, right, through the promise of this salvific program. We're going to come in and spend all this money. It's going to trickle down and everyone's going to do great. And then it doesn't happen, right? That it's sort of, there are sort of pre-existing circuits and hierarchies that tend to benefit those in an already privileged position. So creating this alongside them, I felt the need to amplify their voices and their stories, and not to sort of tell them as a, by the way, this person was also employed in this sector, but to really think about them as co-creating this program or the operation of this program alongside the CEOs of the program that came down. I hope that answers your question, but it's an important one, I think, for anthropologists in particular.
No, I appreciate that. And I think it's really important to think through those considerations as we enter the field, and we, truly don't ever exit it because we're part of a community or we're part of a research paradigm that continues. I also wanted to sort of think through, we're living in a moment, particularly in the US, of a lot of companies, a lot of organizations committing to anti-racism, to justice initiatives. And we're seeing a lot of rhetoric around this. But, based on your research, your experience, what kinds of traction do you think companies might have, given that they're sort of putting out all these different manifestos for, and I'd say, embracing racial justice, but organizationally, many of the structures remain the same. Do you see any bright spots, or, do you sort of see more of the same?
Thank you. That is a difficult question, only personally because of my inclination to be an optimist. But, we've just come out of this sort of this moment of the Black History Month where we saw all these statements on diversity and inclusion and wonderful commentaries by major corporations that are rooted in the continued indebtedness of communities of color, that are deeply rooted in the capitalist systems of oppression, that rely on the devaluing of life in particular ways, and the sort of emptying out of ways of life and communities, and relies on, we're in a pandemic right now, and think about the disproportionate ways that communities of color, Black communities, Asian communities have been impacted because of economic realities, right? Think about the frontline workers that have had to go to work in person through the sort of worst swings of COVID-19. I say all that to say that the lip service towards diversity, inclusion, and that sort of rhetoric in these companies is heartening, that at least there's language around it. But it's difficult to think about next steps when these companies, these corporations are deeply rooted in fact, their existence depends upon the oppression of communities of color. That's what they're, I mean, that's the sort of the logic of racial capitalism. So it's good to say, but, and important to think with, but, you know, we really have to think about if we are organizing, if we're sort of advocating for racial and social justice, what is our ultimate aim and what does the future that we envision look like? Does it look like more people of color on the board of major corporations, or does it look like a total overhaul of our financial relations with one another?
So wonderfully, we're getting some questions in the Q&A. And before I circle back to those questions, I wanted to sort of end my question with, you started off with talking about the contributions of Black feminist thought and scholarship and praxis. And I'm wondering, how would academia be rethought, reimagined if we were in Black feminist tradition to rethink the production of knowledge?
Yeah, thank you. It would look really, I think I'll just take it from one perspective. It would look completely different. So I'll just sort of hew closer to the comments that I already made about questions of publishing, for instance, right? This is a sort of deeply entrenched value system that people working within the academy, having a sole authored monograph or being first author on peer-reviewed publications is key, right, to developing one CV. So jointly authoring things or thinking about communal practices of, so in the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, for instance, depending on our individual needs, sometimes one of us will be first author, other times we publish as a collective such that there's no individual lead author, which makes it either illegible or really messy for some of us in particular way, professionally, right? But the work is politically important and culturally important to us such that those are the decisions that we make. Again, we make them together, right? So there have been times when particular members would be up for tenure and needed things or would be on the job market. But it just is a realization of the differing positionings and the hierarchies within these groups. So that's why I keep sort of talking about the and yet, that it's not a sort of utopia where we just come together and hold hands and produce knowledge together, that there is still this sort of messiness and the unevenness in which we find ourselves. We all live in these sort of moments of difference, but just being aware of them and naming them. So for instance, Kristen Smith has had the site Black Women online movement, which has transformed a lot of the sort of publishing that I have come in contact with, that people are more mindful of the ways that they're citing Black women and the kinds of power that citational practices have. So again, I'm not sort of advocating for this kind of moment of utopia that's going to implode academia, but really to be aware of our spaces of privilege, perhaps, and to think about how we want to work in community with one another.
Thank you for that. And I think the pandemic has laid bare sort of the problematic of what happens when we put publishing expectations on individual bodies, given sort of the gendered and racialized ways in which the care economy works. And for many of us who are engaged in that work as well as academia, it has been next to impossible. I'm going to move on to our audience questions. And our first one comes from Christina Mertens, and I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. She asks, it is interesting to see that all ethnical backgrounds in Latin America seems to share a very similar situation in relation to the history of race and labor that you underlined in your research. However, it also seems that the focus on a former British colony brings a unique perspective to the first point you made in your talk, our place in academia. Could you share your perspective on race and academic labor?
Sorry, thank you, I was muted. So the tail end of the question, can I share my perspectives on race and academic labor? Yes, but I want to be sure I connect it to the earlier half of the question, which seemed to be about ethnicity in Latin America. Is that, was I hearing that right, Banu?
I think it is, to see that all ethnic backgrounds, Latin America, share a similar situation in relation to race and labor, but given sort of the US Virgin Islands and that it was a Dutch, Danish colonial, site, how does potentially that, if I understand it correctly, relate to these questions around race and academic labor?
Oh, that's a more difficult thread to not. Maybe I'll just start with the second half of the question about race and academic labor, which is to take up what you were just saying, Banu, which is the ways that the sort of care economy has exacerbated what we have long lived. I have also published and thought deeply about the neoliberalization of the academy as a space of labor and the kinds of hierarchies that are obfuscated, not just to our students, but amongst ourselves in particular ways, right? That there's adjunct labor, there are people in variously precarious positions, and that's not to essentialize and say that those kind of marginalized people are always and forever people of color, but statistically, that tends to be the case. Black women in particular, teach an outside proportion of adjunct courses in the United States, so that kind of labor falls on particular communities, racialized and gendered bodies in challenging ways historically, right? This is the sort of norm. That was the status quo before the pandemic, which, as you point to, has only sort of exacerbated for those with additional layers of generational requirements, if they have aging parents, if they have children, if they have partners, right? That life has become more complicated. For instance, we're all Zooming from our various spaces, and who knows what's going on the outside of this picture window for many people tuning in, right? So that if the sort of bare minimum was deeply inequitable hierarchies, the moment in which we find ourselves must be a moment of reckoning in which we are really faced with why is it that some people, as you talk about, are struggling to publish anything at all, and other people are having a sort of renaissance on their CV, right? That the kinds of labors that people are variously tied to and freed from in a crisis, I think, are very telling of what our norm is, right? That this isn't a sort of departure from our norm. Certainly it's a deepening of, it's an explosion of, but I think it's very telling of what we were already dwelling in and the ways in which we were already unequally existing in relation to one another.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. And I would encourage all of our attendees to send their questions forward. We'd be happy to address them as we move forward. As we're thinking about sort of the academy and its future, what are your thoughts on sort of the students, particularly students of color, who have been, I would say, experiencing the pandemic in even more difficult ways compared to maybe some of those students who were privileged or had resources available to them? You know, as we think through our theoretical lenses, but also apply them in the context of academia, what are you sort of seeing?
Yeah, I think for students, it's incredibly difficult on the whole, right? I think it's incredibly difficult. But so I, for instance, work in the US Virgin Islands. So I'm seeing this at every educational level. So there are students in K through 12, which are attempting to learn remotely. I have my students at the university level. And so much of this move to Zooming and online, which appears, again, this is a lot like my work in the EDC program. It is purposely, there's an obfuscation that makes it appear seamless, right? That we're sort of magically going to relocate and all will be well and everyone will be wealthier. But that obfuscation is purposeful and that there is much labor and much inequity that is embedded in that, right? So this move to Zoom and online assumes so much, right? There are students for which they have to, driving to spaces of public internet access is a norm for their lives, right? That they don't have regular internet or unstable, particularly in the Virgin Islands, unstable internet, and that they feel the need to perform this role of, student who's excelling in their class, which is really difficult based on the material conditions of their lives. Again, a lot of times students of color, students in these developing countries, spaces like the US Virgin Islands are struggling with this every day. And then when we think about the demands placed to be online all the time, what does that mean? And what kinds of realities are revealed when we can see into each other's homes or cars or, whatever spaces people have to access internet in order to have conversations like these. Yeah, so again, I think this is a sort of moment of reckoning in which it's very telling what were these inequalities before that we're now becoming more confronted with.
Yeah, no, thank you for that perspective. And as we wait for potentially more questions to come in, I sort of wanted to go back to this, thought that you had of we need to go far together. the collective, the success of the collective and the coalitions. When we think through Black feminist scholarship and activism, where do you see potential for such coalitions to take shape? Is it in the creation of knowledge? Is it in sort of administrative roles? How do you sort of see that collective and coalition taking shape?
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, it's a sort of necessity of acting where you are. So the role that I am currently in is primarily administrative at Barnard, and I use my skills and again, my awareness of various forms of privilege that I have to facilitate this work because it's politically important to me. So to my mind, this work can be done through faculty roles, administratively, outside of the academy as a whole. I mean, the sort of struggle for social justice and racial justice for me is the import of it and the power of it is coming together across these spaces, right? That there's a sort of way in which power is maintained by dividing people, these sort of minuscule spaces of access to privilege that people sort of prize, right? That are sort of covetous of, well, I have this, and if I don't protect this, then I could end up like that, right? I could end up in this adjunct position, for instance. But it's in coming together around things like organizing, supporting striking, in the sort of moments of vulnerability of potentially losing privilege, or at least acknowledging it, that people can come together and enact some forms of change. So that's what I see. It's not so much about what is the sort of source, what is the sort of space in which change can originate, but how do we shift our mindsets so that we're able to sort of think collectively, act collectively, write collectively, right? That it's a displacement of the sort of individual, which is difficult. So I know that this is a tough prescription to follow. So I tried to sort of, really return to that point. It's hard. It's financially costly. It can be professionally costly. It's just hard. And it's something that you have to continually navigate. It's not like you have worked this out with your collective and now it's settled forever and always, right? That people are complicated and lives are complicated. There will continually be things that come up that have to be navigated, but the possibilities for change that brings with it are so powerful that my position, at least, is that we have no choice but to reach across to one another, across these trainings and spaces and disciplines and borders and spaces of power, and think about, again, what is the future that we want to make for ourselves? Or are we fine with the way things were before?
Yeah, thank you for that. And absolutely, it's emotionally exhausting. It's physically exhausting at times to continue this work and sometimes feel quite alone, even if you are part of a collective or coalition. Our next question comes from Maureen Scully, who herself is in the field of organization studies, written quite a bit, including around tempered radicalism. So her questions, thank you so much for this insightful talk. When we publish provocative works that challenge the mainstream of our fields, we often get pushback. I'm curious about what kind of pushback you've gotten and how you've addressed it. I ask this in the spirit of collaboration. We often struggle alone with problematic reviews of our work, but if we name the ways in which we steward our pioneering work, it can help everyone, especially emerging scholars and new voices. So thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's a very generous question. Absolutely. And thank you for joining me in, I think, tempering the enthusiasm of the sort of other future that I am envisioning, because it is important to sort of have a really grounded understanding of the work, of the labor, right? That it's really easy to envision this alternate future, but to work toward it is a really different enterprise. So some of the work that I have published that has been sort of, that has perhaps challenged some of the disciplinary norms of my training as an anthropologist. I co-authored a piece with two colleagues not long after completing graduate school. And it was really sort of taking the discipline of anthropology to task. It was 3 women of color, 2 colleagues and myself. And we wrote about the kind of centering of the white male gaze in anthropology, both historically and what we were experiencing in that present moment, that we had recently completed our training. And we felt that we were expected to occupy this position of anthropologists in particular ways, that there were disciplinary and structural ways that we were positioned as sort of imposters in the classroom and in our various departments. We named some of those going through our ethnographic work and our graduate training, which was tricky and hard. and costly in some ways, right? We talked about experiences on the job market. And at that point, most of us were junior. And it was hard, and there was pushback, and we felt conflicted about how to name certain difficulties that we had experienced as junior scholars. But we decided to publish that piece anyway, because we thought it was important for people that were even more junior than us, right? So people that were still in graduate school and felt that they were alone or isolated, that they were the only ones that were doing it wrong, or felt that they didn't belong there, or that they were imposters, right? And in the year since, this is nearly 10 years ago, in the year since, we have gotten so much feedback from former graduate students who are now junior faculty, just saying, thank you for saying that, because I thought I was going crazy. Thank you for saying that the kinds of emotional labor that students would expect from me would be impossible to carry. And yet I would feel obligated to carry it because there was nobody else, because I was the only person of color in the department. And if they didn't talk to me, they wouldn't talk to anyone. So there has been gratitude, which is wonderful, but it was difficult to write that piece and to think about the things that we had to reveal about our trajectories in order to name some of those structural difficulties that we had had. And it's important to say we all came through the same department, but our orientations theoretically and in terms of area are all really different. And so for us to sort of sit together and think about some of the commonality that we had experienced structurally as women of color was important and productive, but also in many ways really painful. So, yeah, the publishing piece is key, I think.
Yeah. And Maureen says, that was so brave. Thank you for that empowering example. So it is absolutely important to be able to say these things and to create opportunities and spaces for those who are coming after us. So thank you for that. One of my questions is, the title of our conversation series is Anti-Racist Feminist Organizing. How does that resonate with you? How do you sort of see that both maybe in the more micro day-to-day practices, but more also in sort of the more macro perspective of how we think about society and our structures? And I'll let you answer however, focused or broad you want to think about that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I had my intention in crafting these talks was really that the first half of the commentary would speak really clearly to the ways in which my social justice work and the way that we organize ourselves. And this is why I brought in Alexis Gumb's work, which I think is so powerful, thinking beyond the space of the human, right? How can we look at the world we inhabit and think about the ways in which other forms of life have come together to make their way in impossible situations, which I think we are inhabiting. I think we're inhabiting an impossible situation in the kind of moment of anti-Asian violence we're experiencing, in the seemingly unending killing of unarmed Black people. These are impossible situations to maintain humanity throughout. And yet here we are, right? So we have to find lessons for how we continue to go day to day. And what that is for me is that naming of white supremacy as the sort of force, again, the framework against which we have to push, right? That all of our organizing, all of our anti-racist, all of our feminist work is exactly to push against the sort of marginalizing, the separating, the sort of naming of individual spaces of marginalization, right? To take all of these seemingly disparate things, right? The rise of white supremacy we saw in the insurrection on January 6th, all of these things which seem different and which are presented to us as different, right? And have absolutely important histories to engage with, but I would argue are deeply rooted in exactly this sort of moment and this space and this thought and framework of white supremacy. So that to do any of this anti-racist and feminist work, we have to name what it is we're pushing against. And we have to understand these struggles as having common cause, right? Not because we're forcing them to, but because that is the reality of it, right? That these kinds of these moments of violence emerge from the same sort of space of thinking and framework.
Yeah, no, thank you for helping us sort of think through that. As we think about engaging those who may not be well versed in feminist thought, let alone Black feminist thought. How do we extend that invitation to start forming coalitions with people who need to sort of hear what's happening in the experiences of people who are being marginalized or engaging in additional labor, emotional labor, and other kinds? Have you sort of tried this, and what are some of your thoughts on inviting people to conversations that are going to be difficult?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of this is difficult, and it's true that we all come with varying histories and levels of familiarity with this Black feminist praxis and theory. And yet in this moment in particular, it strikes me that there is so much information and so many resources that are made publicly available that if folks choose to avail themselves of it. I'm thinking, for instance, of 2 different syllabi projects that I've been involved in. Right now we're crafting a transnational Black feminist syllabus through a working group at Barnard. But I have also been part of a collective that crafted a Caribbean debt syllabus out of Colombia, right? So it's sort of thinking through what are the spaces in which you recognize that you are not well versed, and just asking those questions, right? Because there is an inviting in, absolutely, but there's also, for me, importantly, a desire to be more informed. It shouldn't come as a surprise to people who are paying attention in this country that Black people are killed at a disproportionately high rate by the military industrial complex, by the police, right? That ought not to come as a surprise, and it's telling if it does. And so it's seeking out those to my mind, those resources are abundant. And so it's a matter of seeking them out and trying to, again, be in coalition with people who are, it's not reinventing the wheel, which is so often the impulse. Like, I have realized that racism exists, I will go form a group. But rather, learning from and existing in community with people who have been doing this work for a long time. That was one of the key points that we made in our Virgin Studies Collective, right? That we are learning from people who have been doing this for a long time, right? Who have come up against these structural, who have been pushing against these structural inequalities for a long time. I mean, we're not trying to start over, right? That we're trying to sort of build on so that we can further this cause.
Yeah, thank you for that. And absolutely, invitations come when people are ready to be invited. And right now it seems like there's a lot that people can be doing to educate themselves, particularly on history. When I think about some of your introductory remarks, I'm really wondering if you could sort of share with us how you think about theory versus praxis or activism. Is there a boundary, or is it porous? And how do you sort of go between those 2 domains, if at all they're distinct?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, I think that they are distinct sort of spaces, but if I'm answering this question in relation to this series in particular, and thinking about my social justice work, I think that they necessarily have to inform one another, or else I don't understand the role that they can play in any kind of organizing or activist model, right? So there is, of course, the theory. So let me stick with the example that I've worked with throughout, the sort of theory of collective action, right? That the praxis of that must emerge from that, right? That thinking about, again, the messiness of enacting this theory has to be taken up. It's the sort of living of it, right? The sort of messy dailiness of it that has got to happen. So there's of course the necessity for this theorization and for naming these differences, absolutely, right? That is the sort of balm of the academy. But then if there's a sort of next step, if we're thinking about organizing, that there must be an implementation, a sort of taking up, and engaging with, a grappling with, again, it's complicated, with the sort of theories that we have put together, right? We have named, we have theorized, we've considered, how can we enact them? How can we attempt anyway to use them to transform the spaces we inhabit and the lives that we're living?
No, thank you for that. So just to expand on that, and again, I would invite all our attendees to ask questions, but maybe they're just listening in, which is fine too, to sort of take that perspective of, theory and praxis, and how do you sort of look for that when you carry out your ethnographic work? How do you look for these moments in which theory informs what you see versus you know what people are doing because you've engaged in similar praxis yourself?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, particularly for an anthropologist, because, in my methodology courses, for instance, it seems that, grad students will go out to the field and they have all of these sort of theories and they look for ways to sort of, to sort of map those onto the realities they see. Oh, this is structural. Oh, which of course, right, is problematic. And we have to think about the ways in which, what people are saying to us, I'm speaking as anthropologists, and the kinds of material practices, the kind of quotidian practices that they engage in, have got to take center stage, right? So there is the relationship, of course, and we have to think through, yes, these are the sort of framing ways in which we can make sense of these individual spaces, right? These are the ways we can connect and recognize the structural forces that we're naming, right? Of which these are but an instance, right? So the Virgin Islands is but an instance of this kinds of push towards neoliberalism as the model of development, absolutely. And yet there's something particular about it. So the fact that these women take off their lapel pins, right? The fact that they engage in these particular agentive practices remain important, right? So I want to hold on to the particularity of the place, at the same time thinking through the kinds of theoretical models that allow me to connect it up to more sort of broader ways of thinking and other spaces, because it allows for connection, right? Because it allows for thinking through how the EDC, for instance, is connected to export processing zones in Jamaica, right? To garment manufacturing in Southeast Asia, to maquiladora programs in Mexico, right? In an earlier moment, right? How the sort of gutting of Latin American economies in the 1970s and 80s is directly related to the kinds of emptying out of economic possibilities in the Virgin Islands today that we see with the EDC program, right? So when something like an implosion happens, so the Stanford Financial closes, people end up with no money at all, right? So again, thinking through these sort of theories of structural inequality, and also holding on to the particularity of this place, not because it's a sort of interesting anecdote, but because it's crucially important to understand how these sort of individually positioned actors and places inflect these larger sort of forces.
No, thank you for that. It really reminds me of Gayatri Spivak's sort of, discussion around the limits of theory and how we can use theory at the margins, or those theories that come from domains not informed by sort of Western epistemologies and are place-based and even indigenous, to think about some of the ways people are engaging in what they're doing. I'm going to go to another question from our audience. Allison Pullen, who actually is my co-editor-in-chief at Gender Work and Organization. And she says, thank you so much for this talk. I am inspired to keep learning and listening. Thank you for talking about your academic privilege. Did you experience class struggles doing your ethnographic work in your own community? And how did you navigate this? Does this inform the way you write? Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the questions from the audience, and from you, Banu, who've been incredibly generous. So I appreciate you taking that up. Yeah, so what I will say is that the way that I came to this project was exactly because of class privilege, actually, which is how it came to theorize this project. So when I got my undergraduate degree in cultural anthropology, I moved back to St. Croix, and I was sort of casting about, trying to think about what was next. And a number of people that I knew from high school and just from my life on St. Croix suggested, oh, you should just get one of these EDC jobs. It's a nice landing place. You'll make plenty of money and you won't have to do anything. And you can sort of think about the next step if you want to go on to graduate school. And I said over and over, I don't know anything about finance. I am the wrong candidate for this. And what was telling was the response uniformly was, that doesn't matter. You don't actually have to do anything. That the purpose of these jobs is that they have to fill these sort of quotas of local workers, but in fact, they're not going to entrust you with any responsibility, and you'll just get paid to sort of be the local person, right? And those conversations happened exactly because of who I was and my various positionings, my class positioning, my educational background, the things that I went on to theorize and write about as hierarchies, I had lived. And I was really strongly urged to name those. When I was putting together the final version of my manuscript, one of the reviewers said, we need to understand where you fit into all of this. You're talking about the sort of autoethnographic and you're positioning, you know, the sort of native anthropologist in the model of Zora Neale Hurston, but what was your background? What was your class background? As you name the kinds of trajectories and historical, the pre-existing hierarchies and the future opportunities, how did you come into these circles, right? How did people come to trust you? How did you gain access to these, both to these women and to these companies? And so it's exactly because of my own class positioning that I was able to tell this story, right? Which is absolutely a form of privilege. I had both the sort of local access of having been from there and having people who trusted me not to betray them in particular ways or misrepresent their stories, but I was also seen as somebody safe. I was seen as somebody who sort of like them, which I had to do work to undo as an anthropologist, right? There was some of that. I've recently published a piece where I talk about some of that I had to undo some of that assumption that we're all the same, you're with us, right? That you are us, we are all Virgin Islanders together, and we're all either against this program or for this program. And it was work as an anthropologist to sort of step back and really prioritize this emergent identity at that time of anthropologists, that no, I really want to sort of think through these hierarchies. I want us to name them together and think about how we occupy them, which was hard because again, these are people that you know in personal ways. So to try to separate them was difficult, but important work.
So thank you. Allison says, thank you. She's looking forward to reading your work. I have another question for Maureen, who's very generous. She says, Banu, I think we're asking fewer questions because you're asking wonderful ones. I have one more if it's okay. I agree that the quotidian details tell us so much about lived experience and everyday moments of resistance when we're in the field. What about when we go to places where we might miss some of those subtle signals? I have been impressed with graduate students who see things I'd miss. What do you think about field work with 2 or 3 people listening in the field, but not in a way that might overwhelm the people we're listening to and learning with?
I think that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I think that's an interesting model. I haven't myself practiced that and I'm not familiar with it. But I do think that differently positioned listeners will get different answers from their informants. At the same time, there is a value on the sort of long and deep connection of the informant to the anthropologist. I do think that thinking more broadly about the kinds of information that can be gained from different perspectives is key. I think that people will respond to graduate students perhaps differently than they would to emeritus professor, for instance, right? Or that they will respond to someone that they've known for 20 years very differently than someone that just sort of lands and is living in a particular neighborhood and driving a certain kind of car. And I think that we need to be more mindful and just name, again, these kinds of spaces that we inhabit and just be aware of them, which is not to say repudiate them, but to just be aware of the spaces that we occupy and how people will sort of engage with us, both in the sort of realm of social justice work and in our academic work.
No, thank you for that, Tami. As you were speaking, I was sort of thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to write and publish in a way, it's like a thrice told tale of you're looking at the same phenomenon, but everybody has a different interpretation. And while traditional academia tells us to merge and validate, what if we chose not to? What if we chose to write parallel stories and interpretations that might even be going against each other perpendicularly and orthogonally rather than neatly? I think we might be uncovering some really interesting ways in which we see phenomenon and even theorize about the world. I'd love to hear more from our attendees. I think they're captured and listening to us. So, I certainly don't want to overwhelm you, but I also want to open it up to you and to say, what are those things that you think about, moving forward in this new sort of potential age where we have some optimism with the ways in which we have a president and a first VP, but at the same time, sort of these, especially in the US, mechanisms that are working to take us in a direction that I would say we don't want to go to. So there's a pull and a push of history happening. And in this moment, how does Black feminist theory and theorizing and activism sort of help you understand the moment, but also move forward?
Thank you. Yeah, I will say, in order to answer that, we have a brand new sort of administration in this country. So I will say that relying on the kinds of training and previous histories that have come before in the Black feminist tradition are what have gotten me through the previous 4 years, right? We're like 3 months into it now. But what got me through the past 4 years is just thinking about the really, again, impossible and difficult times, thinking about work like Audre Lorde's cancer journals, right? How have people just been in spaces that feel designed to kill them, both physically and economically, and just in all possible realms, right? You are expendable, and this is out to kill you, right? That the structure is out to eradicate you. How do you not just survive that, but how do you continue to produce? How do you continue to thrive in a space like that? Which is why I have relied so heavily on the sort of writings and theories of Black feminist thought, out of necessity, out of the fact that I am not the first person that have found myself in a position that feels impossible, that in many ways is impossible, right? The Black women in particular have been in this bind for generations and have written about it. And I am not the first to write about it or to try to organize around it. So it has enabled me to sort of both survive and to be generative. And in this moment, which, yeah, I would hope is a sort of swing away from where we have been. Again, my comments are tailored towards those of us in the United States right now. I think I continue to rely on those lessons to think about, okay, now that we perhaps have a different set of realities that we can work with, what can we, again, both envision and enact? How can we sort of think about taking on, because these are all structural forces, right? How can we continue to organize for those who, for instance, are working in the prison industrial complex, to think about things like migration and both defunding police and working against ICE, for instance, right? Deportation and separation of families. Yes, we have a different administration, a different moment, but what are the kinds of structural realities that continue in this moment? And what are the kinds of lessons that we can take with us from the earlier moment to sort of push the needle forward such that we don't become complacent?
Yeah, that's very, very thought-provoking. And actually, our next question really dovetails nicely with what you sort of just shared. It comes from C.V. Harkwell, who says, what have you come to treasure from your collective approach to writing? What have you personally learned as a scholar by writing in as part of a collective? And here, I think collective can mean, in adding, and how did you all discover your collective voice, in thinking through these sort of issues and approaches to our work?
Thank you. That is a lovely question. I particularly like the beginning. What have I come to treasure about writing in a collective? I think that it helps to refine, to work in community helps to refine, I'll speak for myself, to refine my authorial voice, and helps me to become clearer in my spaces of intervention and in my investments, right? That a lot can be said if one is writing alone, but if you're writing in community with people outside of your discipline, and particularly that the interdisciplinarity, so I'm working with a visual artist and a novelist who will push me and just say, what is, not just, get rid of the jargon, but what does that mean, right? Why is this your primary investment? That it has sort of forced me to hone in on what my primary investments are. And that is the thing that I think I have come to treasure, having a clearer sense of my political stakes in these conversations, in these things we're writing about. So I'll give a quick example, if that's okay. We recently published a piece in a Danish journal on archival records. And we were the first people that had had access to these penal records of these women who had led a labor uprising in the Virgin Islands in 1878. They were shipped from the Virgin Islands to Denmark, and their penal records were in Danish, clearly, and they had not been translated until about 1.5 years ago, when we engaged a translator who put them into English for us so we could work with them. And we were looking at the ways in which these leaders of this labor revolt had been represented in these Danish records, right? Which had been done by Danish scholars, but never by women of color, never by Virgin Islanders, right? And so we had a completely different perspective on basically everything, right? So it was this kind of quantitative assessment of, okay, prisoner comes in with this in their possession. She has one pair of earrings, complaining of a headache, right? Put in this space. And we were really able, working together, to flesh it out, to say, well, why would a person be in possession of a pair of earrings if they're being shipped across the world to be imprisoned, right? They're absolutely certain that they're going to be imprisoned, possibly put to death. Why would they take particular things with them? Why would they be in community in particular ways? Why would they correspond? There's a record of correspondence. So just asking different questions, that working in community with people deeply aware of our different positionings has produced different forms of knowledge. I mean, there's really no other way for me to say that I have felt freed to ask different questions, and to think more capaciously about the kinds of projects that I take up, because I'm pushed by people whom I trust, and people whose very different disciplinary perspectives I respect.
That's so incredibly powerful, Tami, just to kind of really rethink the entire reality through which we understand norms, values, cultures, and structures of society, by asking different questions, because we are in community, because our our spirit and our sort of ethical commitment is very different than what theory would tell us to do, in a very transactional way, I think. I wanted to go to a question from Geraldine, who says, thank you for your time and the work you're doing as it pertains to Black feminist epistemology. Do you think traditional academic institutions, especially PWIs, acknowledge and address how white supremacy values are intertwined in the structures and practices of these institutions? Do you think these institutions are ready to restructure and become more accountable and inclusive?
I wish that we were in conversation, Geraldine, so that I could ask you what you think. Because I think it's difficult. Again, reminds me so much of your question, with a sort of slightly different spin, Banu, about corporations, that there is now this sort of, not just a push, but really a necessity to have diversity inclusion be a part of the mission statement, or to be at least acknowledging of the kinds of complex, deeply racist histories in which many of these institutions are founded. We've been in the last year in this moment of reckoning around things like monuments, naming of institutions, right? So yes, I think that there is an awareness of the historic, contemporary, interconnected forms of racism around a lot of predominantly white institutions. And I don't know, again, it's the same answer as a corporation. It's difficult to imagine a wholesale embrace of the deep problematic nature of their formation, because what would that require? It would require them to not exist anymore, right? It would require them to give back all of the money that have, and all of the buildings and all of the wealth and the endowments, right, that have come into being through enslaved labor, through the sort of marginalization of communities of color. So I think it's a very difficult thing, again, to think about this new world looking like and containing the same institutions that have been part of our lives for all of our lives. It's difficult. It's a sort of question of the master's tools and the master's house. Yes, of course, yes. There's a different acknowledgement of diversity and these pushes, right, for thinking about ratios and quotas in particular ways. Absolutely, there is important work that has been done to create spaces of access. And yet, I don't think that has produced the kinds of results or the kinds of, really interventions into capitalist processes or neoliberal processes in the academy that some of us would hope for.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as we're sort of coming to the very end of our session, which I know is to some extent incredibly uplifting, but I also recognize there's much work to be done. I'd love to hear some thoughts as we start to wrap up, Tami, of, what do you hope that we collectively think about as we move forward? What should we learn together, and what should we do as a community that wants to see anti-racist feminist organizing really take hold in the spaces we inhabit?
Thank you. I think hope is such a lovely note to end on, and what we envision. Again, I think if we don't have a clear vision for what our alternate future is, then it becomes difficult to think, what are we working toward? But for me, what I would say is that I hope that we can sort of look at our current spaces. What are the spaces we inhabit, right? That seem, again, everyday to us, but I'll just say some of the sort of activists that we've worked with, things as small as access to letterhead have been transformative to their institutional letterhead, have been transformative to their organizations' access or being legible to particular funding institutions, right? That's just one example. But just thinking about the spaces that we inhabit professionally, personally, politically, and having the investment to work together to think about, okay, if I am not okay with all of these processes of exclusion, all of these processes of marginalization, all of these processes of violence, which are deeply entwined, where am I now, and who can I sort of reach out to work with, who's already doing some of this work? Again, not imagining oneself as a sort of savior of any particular struggle, but what is the work that has already been done, and how can I work in community with them? That would be my hope, just a more sort of acute awareness of the reality that we are all inhabiting. And to my mind, I would think that this lecture series is a really important step in that direction, right? So convening a group like this across the sort of across space, across disciplines, across institutions, but just centering these questions of organizing, Banu. So if I could be in conversation with you for a minute, I think it's really actually provocative and important that you have centered, yes, the theorization piece, but also questions of organizing. How can we enact anti-racist and feminist work through organizing in particular? I think that spaces like this are key, right, to having these kinds of spaces of thought where we can have these conversations.
Yeah, I am truly indebted for that. And I'm so glad that this is, provocative and helpful. There's actually one more question. And Samantha Erskine, who's a really good friend and colleague, also Afro-Latina. So she asks a question, and I'm happy to connect you to afterwards, but what support did mentors give you as you were developing your scholarly identity? How do you mentor PhD students who are passionate about this work but get pushed back as they develop their scholarly identity? And this is, I know, something she has experienced as she pushes back on institutions and theories that don't really reflect the kind of work that she wants to do, but I know this is widely shared. So some concluding thoughts there, and then I think we are all set for the evening.
Great, thank you so much for that question. And yes, please do connect us. I will say, as I have every opportunity I have to say, I always say that I am an anthropologist today because of mentoring, because an anthropologist, Deborah Thomas, took me aside and explained to me what graduate school was, and that it was an avenue that was available to me, and it was something that was a reality that I could occupy. I was a first generation college graduate from St. Croix, who had never heard the word anthropology before. So it's because of her mentoring and her deep commitment to mentoring all of her students that I became an anthropologist and succeeded in graduate study and onward. And because I have benefited in those really transformational ways, it's deeply important to me to mentor students that come into my realm as well. I've worked with a number of women of color in particular, just because of the nature of my work. And there has been overlap with several women of color who's, I'm currently overseeing a dissertation through the University of the West Indies, for instance. And yes, absolutely. In some of this more radical political work, there is pushback from institutions, from departments, disciplinarily. But I think that seeing that there is a commitment from someone on the other side is deeply valuable, right? Understanding that there's a legibility to their work. And again, it's sort of like the jointly authored essay I talked about earlier when we wrote as junior scholars, realizing that they're not the first person to go through this, and they're not entirely alone, just sort of flailing about doing something that has no grounding, but introducing them to these longer, histories of literature and experiences is incredibly powerful. To feel that you are not alone and you're not the first person to be doing this in these precarious positions that grad students are inhabiting is transformative, and allows people to sort of keep going and to tell their stories, which can then benefit those that are coming up even in cohorts behind them. There's a power in that kind of community, I think.
Thank you. And thank you for creating community with us today, really sharing some of your incredibly important work and ideas and experiences, and engaging in provocations and inviting us, I think, to enact these in our day-to-day lives. We are not you know, going to sit by and let some of these white supremacy and other sort of forms of discrimination and racism take foot in the world, as long as we know that we can each of us do something, and we need to do something. So thank you so much, Tami, for starting us off in these conversation series, sharing your incredibly insightful work. And I've learned so much, and I know our audience has as well. So thank you again. We are so appreciative of your time, insights, and your willingness to teach us so much today. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing everyone at our next event, which will be April 1st with Professor Laura Briggs from UMass Amherst. So thank you to everyone, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.